Hi, I'm Jonathan Goell. I want to show you some cameras, the different kinds there are, how they came to be, what some photographers have done with them, and what you as a photographer can do with them too. Now, getting a new camera is a rough proposition for many people. They ask, what kind of camera should I get? How much should I spend? What kind's for me? What should a camera do? I'd like to begin by showing you my first camera, a real jewel, a 1935 Leica that my father got a few years ago, very little money. This is my first camera, really nice. I'm very fond of it. It was a new experience for me to have this because through it I discovered photography. Through its little finder I noticed all kinds of new things that were always there before but I had missed. People on the street, expressions on faces, shadows across walls, everything that you can imagine that I could see, I found that I could photograph with this. Now this old camera you had to squint through to look through, like this, but I didn't mind it, it was fun. Because I consider this camera a great tool to learn both the art and the craft of photography, because it had the three major controls that any good adjustable camera needs. It had a focus control on the lens to control the sharpness of your subject, and it had an aperture and a shutter control to control the amount of light that hits the film. And as it happened, you could also change lenses by unscrewing it and pulling it out and putting in another one. Now because of these flexible qualities, it took me many years to outgrow this camera, and it was great. In fact, I still use it. Although this camera was 1/10 the cost of a professional camera at the time my father bought it, it's far more than 1/10 as good a camera. I learned very quickly on it because, as it's so flexible, I was able to do anything I wanted. It did everything that I demanded of it. And I made a major discovery about photography, which is this: people take pictures, not cameras. And I have the feeling that no matter what kind of camera I'd had before, if it was a more expensive camera, it would have made little difference in the quality of my pictures. This old camera did me just fine. Now shortly I'll show you some other adjustable cameras you can get, but first, what kind of camera is this? This is a Leica rangefinder camera. The rangefinder is essentially a distance finder. With it you can help find for yourself the distance of the subject you're going to photograph. And this is how it works. When you raise the camera to your eye to focus on a subject, say, you'll see through these two windows here, two images of that subject. That's because there's a prism in here and it's connected to the lens, and as you move the lens, those two images, those two subjects will move. And when you are able to bring the two images together in the finder so that you only see one, you'll have effectively focused the lens for that subject at that distance, and subjects at other distance will be somewhat less sharp. Well, because of this ability, you can make very close, strong, and sharp, clear portraits, if you want, of anything, say up to 3 feet away, and no simple camera can do that. There are a lot of modern cameras, good cameras though, that do use this exact same focusing mechanism. I think this camera is so remarkable that I'd like to tell you who its inventor was. It was Oskar Barnack, who in Germany, before the First World War, thought, gee, what the world needs is a small precision camera that is as good as any professional camera and yet can still go in your pocket. And he produced this Leica, which was finally brought out by Ernst Leitz in the 1920s. Here it is, terrific little camera, and it had a collapsible lens, so it made it very portable. But this is the kind of camera that replaced a large view camera, which up until the 1920s is what most people used if they wanted to take professional grade photographs. As you might expect, this little camera was very important to photographers, and it revolutionized not just the film and the camera industry, not just the picture magazine industry of the time, but photography and photojournalism as well. I'd like to show you a Life magazine from 1940 with pictures in it by Robert Capa using a Leica. In a way, the success of these magazines in Europe and America was partially dependent on the kinds of pictures that photographers were making with these little new cameras. They were very right there, they were very candid, they were frenetic, they were alive. Above all, they were candid, and people could carry them in their pockets to an assignment. And look at all the pictures that Capa got just in one day, you know, with a Leica, maybe two Leicas, of everything about this scene. Well, this particular thing was the riots associated with an election in Mexico in 1940. Well, he covered it with his Leica. He wasn't the only photographer, though, to do excellent work with these new breed of small cameras. Cartier-Bresson's name is perhaps associated with this camera as much as any other person is. And he made this photograph of a man jumping over a puddle in Paris on a gray day, and he caught the exact moment, the decisive moment, like that, that would make this picture good, snapping him when he was in midair. He was famous for this kind of picture, and the little light camera enabled him to do it. Another photographer of the time and also later was Alfred Eisenstadt, who began in Germany and later went to work for Life magazine, and he took this picture on VJ Day, 1945, in Times Square, New York City. His job was to cover what people were thinking and feeling and looking like the day peace was declared. And he was waiting at Times Square. Well, he saw the sailor coming down the street, and he noticed that he was kissing every girl in sight. And then he saw, coming from the other way, a nurse in a white uniform, and his journalist instinct connected, and he said, wow, these people are going to get together. And he was ready with his camera, and sure enough, they did. And the moment they came together, he clicked the picture, and this is one of the classics of candid photojournalistic photography. Now, the secret of the small size of this camera was the film that Oscar Barnack designed it to be used with, which was, at the time, 35mm movie film, which looked pretty much like this. In the early days, you couldn't get it like this. The film was supplied on big spools for movie makers, and photographers had to go into a closet with a pair of scissors and cut off just enough to be able to use in the camera, and then they'd take the film outside and photograph it, come back and develop it. It was a big bother, but they didn't mind because it enabled them to use this great little camera. Today, you can buy film wrapped in little metal cassettes like this, and you can get slide film and print film, all kinds of film, even infrared film. But what really secured the popularity of this particular film and camera combination was not just the small size of the film and the camera, but the amount of pictures you could take on a roll, 36. Why? Look, there's 4.5 feet of film in this cassette. Boy, by the way, don't ever do what I'm doing here, because I've just ruined an entire roll of film by exposing it. But there's 4.5 feet of film in this camera, which enables you to take those 36 pictures, which is a tremendous amount of pictures to be able to put on one roll of film. Well, since World War II, a lot of other camera manufacturers have designed cameras that use this film as well. Adjustable cameras, very good cameras, and enough of them have filtered down to the shelves of used camera shelves in camera stores so that you could go and probably find yourself an excellent older professional grade camera such as a Leica at a very reasonable price. Other cameras such as the Contax were made and the Canon were made overseas. They were very good. In the United States, a whole breed of cameras were made which were less expensive but still used this film and were very good. And some of them today can be purchased for as little as $20 to $40, and I'd like to show you two very good ones. The first one was the Argus C3. The Argus C3 was a 35mm camera made here from the late 30s until the late 1950s with very little design change. And just like the Leica, it had shutter speed adjustment, it had a range finder, it had an aperture adjustment on the lens, a very flexible camera, quite a good lens. A lot of reporters used it too, a lot of amateurs used it. And the second camera is the Kodak Pony 135, which was even less expensive than this. And it's a camera which is simplicity itself, even though it has all the major controls, and it's very pocketable. And I've seen them at yard sales for $10 to $15, which is ridiculously inexpensive for a camera that has a good lens and has these controls that allow you such flexibility of picture taking. I'd like to give you a little hint, by the way, in the use of these cameras. A lot of people, when they take pictures, they bring the camera to their eye, and then they hammer on the shutter button to take the picture. They sort of like plunge it, which is a good way to guarantee a blurry picture. I'd like to recommend the following, that you take your elbows and you squeeze them in against your sides rather comfortably like this, and you raise the camera to your eye and you very slowly squeeze off the shutter without tension like this. It's easy. Now, the 35mm rangefinder is not the only kind of 35mm camera you can buy, which takes us back to the 1930s, a sort of epical period in the evolution of cameras, and photography as well. Here's an Exacta. Although this is a post-war model, the pre-war model looked exactly the same. They decided to borrow an old idea in camera design, which was to use a mirror and a ground glass to help you to focus the picture. How did that work? Well, watch this. I'd like to show you something. I'll take the lens out, and I'll take the top off, and I will put down this mirror. See? They put a little mirror in here which enabled you to look through the lens. And when you press the shutter, the mirror would jump out of the way. There you are. The mirror would jump out of the way. The film behind it would be exposed. On top of the camera, they cut out a little hole, 1 by 1.5 inches, and they inserted into it a ground glass screen, which is a translucent screen of well, ground glass, exactly as it sounds. They put it in like this, and then when you put in the lens, and then you open the top, and then you looked into it like this, you wound it, you would be able to see an image which is exactly the same as the lens would see. And assuming your exposure was right, the picture you got would be exactly what you saw on that ground glass screen. This was called a waist level finder, and you looked at it down like this. The real innovation that made this design take off was the substitution of a finder that you look down at for an eye level finder, which was made out of a 5-sided piece of glass, a prism, so that you could then take pictures looking through the lens in a more comfortable fashion like this. When that happened, the single lens reflex camera, as we know it today, was born. And it was really a great innovation in camera designs. The SLR is what it's really called today. SLR, single lens reflex. Now, what do I mean by single lens reflex? Let me do a drawing for you. What they basically did was this. Here was the lens like in any normal camera. Here was the body of the camera. And here was the ground glass screen. The film is here. They put a mirror on a hinge right here. So what would happen is the view would come in, be bounced off the mirror, and you would see it on the screen when you looked down. At the moment of exposure, the mirror would go up like that, and the film behind it would be exposed with light. Fine. The great innovation was the addition of the pentaprism, which is a 5-sided piece of glass which fit on top of the camera, so that the view on the screen here could then be bounced around in rather roundabout way like that to you at an eye level position, so that you would be able to see from here. So here would be a happy photographer. This little innovation caused a riot in a particular area of photography, telephoto photography. It made possible telephoto pictures. What could you do? You could take your lens out, you could put in a very long, powerful telephoto lens, and standing far away from action, you could cover, say, sports events. Look at this picture of the 1963 World Series game. Stop the action from a great distance using a 1,000 millimeter lens, and at the moment the peak action occurred, snap, he got it. Would have been impossible with any other camera except a single lens reflex camera. Now, these old Exactas are very precise and professional grade cameras, and as old and as rickety as they really are quite excellent. And I've seen them for $50 to $100, which I think is an awfully good buy for a camera which will accomplish what this can do. They're very solidly made, they're very nice. And they have another feature about them which makes them an endeared camera to left-handed people, and that is because the winding knob is on the left and you look through it with your left eye if you're left-handed, you can photograph continuously without having to remove the camera from your eye to wind the film. Very nice kind of camera. And the lenses for these cameras are also quite inexpensive. I've seen them on shelves for anywhere from $25 to $30 for mild telephoto lens and not too strong a lens. And you'd have to pay $100 to $200 to buy a lens of equivalent ability for, say, a brand new single lens reflex camera. Now, the newer cameras, really, they haven't changed that much over the years. Here's a Pentax from about, well, I'd say it's just a few years old, and it's almost the same as the Exacta. It's just a little lighter, a little easier to use. The lens is a little faster, a little bit sharper. Minolta and Canon and other manufacturers also make good cameras. And if you find one in a store which is 5 or 10 years old in good, clean working condition, you could expect to pay $75 to $150 for it, and it would be a terrific first camera to get. I've even seen, as a matter of fact, new stripped-down Pentaxes, that is, with very few features on it, but still a basic camera, on sale, on special sales, clearance sales, for as little as $180. $180 for a camera which has all this ability, plus the fact you can, of course, change the lenses. You can, if you want, buy Nikons and Leicas. They're still being made new. There are plenty on the shelves which are used. They're first-rate, excellent cameras. They, however, do not tend to lower in price. Even though my old Leica, say here, is 20 years old, it's, even though it's 20 years old, it's still a very expensive camera to buy second-hand. But whichever camera you use, remember that anything you learn on one camera can be applied to another camera, because the numbering systems for the aperture and the shutter and the focusing are all the same on all cameras around the world. If you're a beginner, I would suggest that you start with an inexpensive 35mm camera, say like this, because I feel it's the least expensive, cheapest way to go. The film is the cheapest, and a camera that's small enough like this, you're very likely to carry around with you all the time. While I have this, I'd like to give you a hint on the best way to hold a single-lens reflex camera, and it's like this. As before, keep your elbows in, but instead of holding the camera on the sides, put one hand under the lens and cradle it, like this. So this way, when you photograph, you not only hold the camera, but you can focus and hold at the same time, like that, with great speed and great comfort. Terrific little camera. Those also were not the only cameras made, or are still being made, which are very useful to buy. And that brings us to another type of camera called the twin-lens reflex camera. Here's one. And here's another. The twin-lens reflex camera was a camera that had a lens for picture taking and a lens for viewing and focusing. How did that work? Simple. Back to the trusty pad. Down on the bottom, a normal camera. Here's the lens, here's the film, and the light came in and exposed the film like that. But up on top, they have another chamber which has a ground glass screen in the top, down in there, and a mirror here, very firmly fixed, and light from the subject would bounce off the mirror coming through the top lens and hit the ground glass screen like that, and you would look at it from the top. This is a very sturdy design, and it's a very popular design, and I'll tell you why. Even though the camera is seemingly, when you look at it, it seems blockier, it really is not that much larger or heavier than a single-lens reflex camera. But a very important advantage to it, if it is, and it is an advantage, is that it takes much larger film than the 35mm camera does. In fact, it takes what's called 120 roll film, which is this. 120 roll film has the advantage of producing, here it is over here, on this side, very large negatives which can make very sharp prints. Here's a 35mm negative, a single frame, to show you by comparison. This negative is 2 1/4 inches square. It's the same size as the viewfinder, in fact. And with negatives like this, you're able to produce sharper, more finer grained, more realistic looking prints than you can with a 35mm camera. The twin lens reflex viewing system is very easy to use. It has the screen up here, as I mentioned, and it's large, and it enables you to very easily focus and compose your pictures. During the 1950s and the 60s, the Japanese camera industry really came through with a lot of terrific versions of the camera. The original one was this Rolleiflex, which was manufactured from the 1920s on, and it still is. But the Japanese came out with models that were very inexpensive. It competed with the Rolleiflex for both popularity and quality. And this particular model is a Yashica mat, which I've seen new sometimes for $80, $90, $100, $125, and I've seen them sometimes for $35 or $40 as well. These cameras, with their large negatives, are capable of producing prints that have a very sharp, smooth-toned quality, a very sort of a realistic, enhanced realistic quality. And I'd like to show you one that I made. I still use these cameras myself. This is a picture of a man in Arizona. And using this camera, I was able to record all the details which I consider unique to this particular person. All the textures of his face and his hat and his shirt. all this, the smoothness of this, the roughness of that. Not just a picture of a face, but a picture of a face with a particular texture to it. As it happens, this camera, though, is good for not just recording the surfaces of things like that, but for snapshots as well. Now, a lot of people you may have seen hold a camera over their head and photograph down into a scene like this. But with a camera like this, it's a little different because you can actually see what you're going to photograph on this screen. Look at it like this and bing, take your picture. Very talented, very nice little camera. Now, there are several kinds of cameras I haven't talked about, and they are the instant cameras like the Polaroid and the new Kodaks, which are such a great breed of camera that I'm going to do an entire show on them. I haven't talked about automatic cameras. They're very popular. I will at some later time. And I also have not talked about the single lens reflex type of 120 roll film camera, the SLR version of the Rolleiflex. That's a very important kind of camera, and I'll also talk about them later, but I would like to show you the ultimate snapshot which one of them in the hands of a photographer made. Not just any photographer, but Neil Armstrong on the moon with Buzz Aldrin. Great picture, ultimate snapshot. A specially rigged up Hasselblad was used for this, and it's so sharp you can even see the reflection of the photographer in the visor of the astronaut. Now, if a camera using large negatives, say 120, can produce a sharp print with more grace and ease than a 35mm negative can, could an even larger negative do an even better job? The answer is yes. When a photographer really wants to take the most realistic and faithful picture of a subject, he uses 4x5-inch film. This film is almost as big as a postcard. It records everything that hits it with tremendous detail. You can get negatives which are even larger than 4x5 inches, but 5x7 or 8x10 inches, and you use negatives like this in a film holder that looks somewhat like this. Film holders carry the film like this, which you load in the dark, by the way. You close this down and you go over to the camera that uses it. The camera that uses this kind of film is practically unchanged since 1839 when cameras were first introduced. What is it? It is the 4x5-inch view camera. Now, the front of the camera is like any other camera. It has a lens, it has shutter speeds, it has apertures, but that's not what's accounting for the increasingly new repopularity, if you will, of this particular camera. I've seen new photography students are using these, and professionals are using these all over again, and there's a particular reason for it, and it's this. The ground glass. The ground glass image on a camera like this, produces a marvelously real and exciting image of the subject you're looking at. It's very realistic. It almost looks like a photograph itself. You focus here, like this, and when you're ready to shoot the picture, you go through a routine that's somewhat like this. Hold on, I'll show you. If I were a photographer using one of these, I'd put on this dark hood, which you've probably seen people do, and I would focus and compose my picture to try and make it perfect. Set the tripod. I would then close the shutter so as not to prematurely expose the film, set the various controls, cock the shutter, and then remember I have a piece of film in this holder. I would insert it in the back, set it, get ready. Oh, can't forget this. Pull out the dark slide. Make my exposure. Push the dark slide back, like this, protecting the film. Pull the film out, and in here I will have a picture of that still life. And when I take it back to my lab and I develop it, I'll have a picture. Now, you might think that that's an awful lot to go through to take a single picture, but keep in mind that people like Matthew Brady and Alexander Gardner managed to cover the entire Civil War with a camera like that, an old wooden one and a much heavier one than that besides. Here's a picture by Alexander Gardner taken in the 1860s of Lincoln and a staff of people around him. Even though this seems like a rather posed photograph, still the photographs of the Civil War have shown us what a painful and devastating war that was. You didn't need an agile or light camera to do it. They did it with those big old clunky cameras. Beautiful record of the Civil War with Brady and everyone took. Documentary photographers are still using large cameras. Here's a picture by Walker Evans. Walker Evans was hired by the government in the 1930s to take pictures of the effects of the Depression in rural America. And here he made a picture with a 4 by 5 inch, maybe even an 8 by 10 inch camera of a farmer shack in Alabama. And he recorded not just the scene, but you can see that it's rough-hewn textured wood. You can see the oilcloth here and the detail in it. You can see the fact that this is an oil lamp and not a lamp one plugs in. The textures in the wash basin, everything is shown. Beautiful quality of light. It's a marvelous, marvelous photograph, and it tells us something about the people who lived in that room. Edward Weston was a photographer who was very, very good at doing still life pictures. His still life pictures are very elegant. This picture on the top of a cabbage leaf, everything is recorded, all the textures, all the tones, the nuances, the veins, beautifully, simply designed photograph, absolutely exquisite. The photograph on the bottom is Pepper number 30 by Edward Weston, and here he caught the beautiful curves of the pepper, the excellent, nice textures, the subtle qualities that peppers have. I'll bet no one has ever seen a pepper or will, until they've seen an Edward Weston pepper, because he saw them in a very, very special way. He photographed it, by the way, in a tin funnel, which was a novel way to do it. Next picture here, well, of course, this is of Truman, and it was made by Arnold Newman using a view camera. And it's a beautiful portrait which shows not just the man, but perhaps what the effect of time and responsibility has had on his face. The textures of the wrinkles, the firmness of the jaw, the hardness of the glasses, the glint off the glass, all of this faithfully picked up by Arnold Newman using a large camera. The last photograph here is by Ansel Adams. And Ansel Adams, I guess he's known as the main and best American landscape photographer. Very beautiful, large, grand picture of Mount Williamson. These pictures were made with view cameras. Photographers using view cameras, large negatives. Larger cameras, on the whole, tend to produce sharper and more detailed pictures. Smaller cameras, well, they're much more portable. Each has its own kind of advantages, of course. Whichever you use, it's what you do as a photographer that counts the most. Remember that and keep shooting. See you next time.